with me, but thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. My name is Emiliano Diaz de Leon. I am the Men's Engagement Specialist with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And I'm so happy to be with you this afternoon. And I'm excited to share with you this webinar. So been looking forward to it for quite a while. And so if you'll be patient with me, I'll launch my slides. All right. So again, thank you so much for joining me for enhancing helpline services for male survivors. And you have all of my contact information there. Most importantly, I would encourage you to follow me on Twitter if you're not already. So there's my Twitter handle, as well as my email address. And I would encourage you to contact me if you have any questions about today's webinar. If you'd like more information, if you'd like to explore the topics that we cover in today's webinar in more detail, feel free to email me at that email address. And then I also encourage you, if you're on social media while you're watching today's webinar, to please share your insights, any information that you feel like is important with your friends and your followers, and use the hashtag #MenHealing. I encourage you to use the hashtag across social media platforms and look at some of the other things that are posted around that. You'll find that to be one of the most common hashtags around male survivors of sexual violence. And so definitely want to encourage you to share because one of the things that we know is that most of us know a boy or man who has had some experience of sexual violence in our life. And the information that you share with them might help them begin that journey of healing. So we're going to explore that a little bit. And I'm sure as you've already done, you've already introduced yourself in the chat room. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being with me today. And I am curious, I'll open up the chat room here. And so I see that Becky shared from Iowa Victim Services Call Center. She's excited to enhance my advocacy for males. Thank you so much for being with us, Becky. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through today's webinar. What brought you to today's webinar? What are you hoping to take away from today's webinar? So I would encourage you just to make a note to yourself so that you can keep that in mind as we go through this content. Let me tell you a little bit about TAASA. The Texas Association Against Sexual Assault is located here in Austin, Texas. We're a statewide advocacy organization like IowaCASA that works to address and eliminate sexual violence through public policy, training, prevention work, and support to programs that serve survivors of sexual violence. So like IowaCASA, as our sister coalition, we're engaged in very similar work. And so we support and represent all the rape crisis centers in the state of Texas. As part of our work, we lend our support and our technical assistance and our training to our sister coalitions like IowaCASA and other coalitions around the country and territories. So I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon to share my experience and my expertise with working with male survivors of sexual violence, both as a victim advocate and as a training and technical assistance provider at TAASA. I've been with TAASA now for 13 years. TAASA has been around since the early 80s, and we provide really comprehensive programs as well as does IowaCASA. So, but I want to encourage you to reach out to me if I can be of any additional assistance after today's webinar. So I'm going to start by sharing a video. It's a spoken word piece by Kevin Cantor. It's called People You May Know. One of the things that I want to encourage you to do before I share it with you is to take care of yourself. So the reality is that many of us know and love a male survivor of sexual violence. And so if you need to walk away, if you need to take a break, If you need to leave today's webinar, I want to encourage you to do that. I want to encourage you to take care of yourself. If you yourself are a male survivor of sexual violence, I encourage you to take care of yourself. This video can be triggering and includes descriptions of sexual violence. And so I encourage you to take care of yourself. More importantly, I want to encourage you to share this video across your social media platforms with your friends, family members, and followers. It's a powerful story, and I think you'll see why.
Emiliano, this is Maddie. Unfortunately, we cannot hear the sound from that. I know we had to kind of change up some of the...
Let's try it again. Thank you, Maddie. Technology, folks. Here we go. Thank you for your patience.
When my rapist showed up under the People You May Know tab on Facebook, it felt like the closest to a crime scene I've ever been. That is, if I don't count the clockwork murder that I make of my own memory every time that I drive down Colfax Avenue. Still, I sit in my living room and I sift for clues. Click. I see myself caught in his teeth. He is dancing with his shirt off in a city that I've never been to. Click. He is eating sushi over a few beers with friends, and I am under his fingernails. Click. I know that alley. Click. I killed the memory of that t-shirt. Click. This is an old photograph. It's a baby picture. There's also an older man, presumably his father. They are both round and bright and still smiling. Click, he is shirtless again, and I catch my reflection in the weight room mirror. Hashtag beast mode selfie. I call him the wolf when I write about him. The wolf, so as to make him as storybook as possible. The wolf when I write about him, which is to say, when my memory escapes the murder or when the internet suggests it. Facebook informs me that we have 3 mutual friends, which is to say that he is people you may know, which is to say I am people you may know. And there are people that know and people that don't know, and people that don't know I want to know, I'm afraid to let know, and probably people that know him, that know of me, that know. The word no is a flock of sleeping sheep sitting in my mouth, and now I know the wolf's middle name. And what he listens to on Spotify, and the all too familiar company that he keeps, and he can no longer be a wolf, or the nameless grave that I dig for myself on bad days. We have 3 mutual friends on Facebook, and now it feels like they are holding the shovel. 64 people liked the shirtless gym pic, and 4 people have told me that they'd rather I said nothing. 2 police officers told me that I must give his act a name or it didn't happen, that obviously I could have fought back, which is to say, no one comes running for young boys who cry rape. When I told my brother, he also asked me why I didn't fight back. Adam, I am, right now, I promise. Every day I write a poem titled Tomorrow. It is a handwritten list of the people I know that love me, and I make sure to put my own name at the top.
So just want you to just take a minute and I want you to think about these questions, and I want you to just take a moment to reflect, and you are welcome to share your answers in the chat room if you like. What's your immediate reaction to Kevin's spoken word piece? So Kevin is just one of many survivors' stories that we've heard, and but every survivor story is different. And Kevin is sharing his piece through spoken word, and deep but real, powerful, tears, powerful. Thank you for sharing that. What stood out to you from Kevin's story? So like as you're listening to Kevin's story, was there anything that stood out to you? Lots of tears. The ending hit me hard, as now he is fighting back every day. He's fighting back. Somebody's heart is breaking, anger, a yearning to move on with a sense of never forgetting the word no, right? That word no is still ringing in my ear. And I apologize that it was so loud, but I think, yeah. The theme of people we know, right? The end when he says he put his name on the top of who loves him. Yeah. Survivors we know that we don't know, folks who cause harm and we don't know. Yeah, I think that's all. These are all really important things to keep in mind as we move through today's webinar. And I think just as you move forward in your advocacy work with male survivors of sexual violence, to keep these things in mind, right? That there are folks that we know who are survivors, but there are also folks that we know who are perpetrators and offenders of sexual violence. We know that to be true in our work, right? And so keep all of that in mind as you go through today's webinar, as well as you work with male survivors in terms of their stories. And then finally, the last question, what, if anything, can you apply from Kevin's spoken word piece to your victim advocacy? So I want you to just take a moment and think about that, write it down, and just keep that in mind and hold that with you as you leave today's webinar, to think about what it is that you can apply to your advocacy work. So some people cannot put a name to something they have never seen or heard of. It's important to get awareness out. Absolutely. That's why I want to encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to share Kevin's story. You can, Kevin Cantor, or people you may know on YouTube, and you'll find it there. And I encourage you to share it, because we all have the power to raise awareness about this particular issue and to encourage male survivors to come forward. When they see those messages, when they see that we are engaged, especially in our personal social media in terms of raising awareness about this issue, they know that we are an ally and that we are a support person and that our organizations are there to support them. Different ideas of what fighting back looks like, absolutely. So all of these things, just, appreciate people's feedback. Your engagement with me in the chat has been amazing so far, so keep it up. And thank you so much for allowing me to share that with you. So we're going to start with Kevin's story and just keeping in mind some of the challenges faced by male survivors. So when we think about the helpline, these are the things that they are already coming to us with, right? I can't tell you how important it is just to be conscious and to be aware of these things that we might not have considered, that both prevent male survivors from coming forward and seeking help through the helpline, or accessing services, whatever those services might be. And so it's not necessarily, it's not us or our organization, it's the challenges that male survivors are experiencing that make it so difficult to come forward. The first one is society stigma for not protecting themselves, right? Like this idea that boys and men should, one of the ideas, the norms that we have around masculinity is that I should protect myself from violence and abuse. And that when I don't, that I'm not really a boy or a man. And so there's a tremendous amount of shame that comes with those ideas of protecting oneself. And so I know that to be true as a male identified person. If you think about the boys and men in your life, what are the messages that they've been given or that you've heard, or that you, if you're a male identified person, have received about protecting yourself, about fighting back, about being strong and not letting anyone hurt you? So these were all messages that I received as a little boy and that I continue to receive as a man. And so I think just keep that sort of in mind, that there's a tremendous amount of stigma and shame attached to these ideas. Victimization because they fail to conform to the macho man stereotype, right? Like we were talking about, like these ideas that we have about the boys and men in our lives and about how they should be, how they should look, how they should talk, how they should walk, how they should present themselves, right? And that we should act. I think all of us at this point are familiar with the man box, right? Like we should act a certain way, we should conform a certain way, we should speak a certain way as a man. And if we don't, like I said, we're shamed for expressing a lack of masculinity, not being man enough. And I'm sure all of us have heard some form of that in our lives, whether we have said that to the boys and men in our lives: man up, act like a man. All of those things, these ideas that we have wrapped around with masculinity are problematic, right? And one of the things we don't realize is that they unfortunately prevent boys and men from coming forward when they have experienced abuse, especially sexual violence. So in addition, they don't want to be perceived as a wimp, right? And that's a wimp is such a, I mean, we could fill up the chat room with words that boys and men are called when they don't conform to these ideas, these rigid ideas around masculinity, right? Wimp is a very, boys and men are called worse, uglier names than wimp. And all of us, as a man, I've heard and I've experienced, I've been called those names myself, right? Even as an adult man, from other boys or other men, when I don't, again, conform or act like or show up or present as a man. And so, and I'm guilty myself of engaging in that kind of language with the boys and men in my life, of reinforcing these narrow ideas about masculinity. But one of the things we don't realize is that it creates sort of a cage, and it doesn't allow us to ask for help or to seek support services. And so I want us just to keep in mind that it isn't necessarily you as the victim advocate or the helpline advocate or your rape crisis center or your organization that is preventing male survivors from coming forward. It's these norms that exist within our society that prevent a lot of boys and men from coming forward whenever they experience sexual violence. And so just keep that in mind as we move forward. Not being believed because they are men, right? So that's an assumption that they have, not necessarily is true for us, because our work as victim advocates is to believe the survivor. And I know and I trust, without being able to see you or hear you, that is one of your values that you hold very dear in terms of your work as a victim advocate. so this perception is not real, but it's a perception that a lot of boys and men have, that they're not going to be believed by that helpline advocate. They're not going to be believed by that family member or that friend. They're not going to be believed by the adults in their life, or law enforcement, or the criminal justice system, et cetera, right? And it itself is a barrier that they've created for themselves, that we know to not be true, because again, we always start from a place of believing survivors. And so I just want us to just consider that for a moment. Being denied the status of victim. So again, this might not be true for us or for our organization, but their perception of our centers is that they will be denied the status of being a victim. They might not themselves call themselves a victim or survivor, and that's okay, right? And we're going to talk about reflecting the language that they use in terms of their identity, their experiences of sexual violence or sexual abuse. But there's a perception within our society and that they carry themselves, that they're going to be denied the status of victim. Partly because sometimes of the names of our organizations, like the Women's Center or the Battered Women's Center. You know, when I first started, I worked at the Battered Women's Center here in Austin, Texas. And so that name itself didn't allow for for other identities of individuals to experience domestic and sexual violence. And so I imagine at the time it prevented a lot of male survivors of, prevented them from coming forward and accessing support services or accessing help over the helpline. And so it's just one of those things that we have to keep in mind, and that part of our work is to transform the culture, to communicate that all survivors, regardless of their race, their gender, their age, their sexual orientation, their religion, etc., are welcomed here, and have access to services. And we have to communicate that as victim advocates, especially over the helpline, that our services are available to them as well. Unfortunately, a lot of male survivors are removed or asked to leave their homes. So when we see boys and men on the street, something to consider, something to keep in mind, that some of them are on the street because they were forced or removed from their home, or they left the home because it was no longer safe for them, and so they ran away, or they left home. They have no other place to go, and so it's important to understand that when male survivors contact us on the helpline, that they might not just be their immediate. They might be in crisis, but it might be around housing. It might be around employment. It might be around medical care. It might be around child care, et cetera. So all of the other things that survivors of all genders are experiencing when they're in crisis. We have to keep in mind that those male identified survivors will come to us with those the same issues, and will have the same needs that other victims and survivors have, and that we need to address those needs before we can address the mental health needs of the survivor, or the legal advocacy of the survivor, or the medical accompaniment of the survivor. So we have to address the crisis that they are presenting before us on the helpline. And so just want us to keep all of this in mind as we do our work as victim advocates. Most male survivors that I've encountered, that I know, didn't really have a support system before they came to the Rape Crisis Center, before they begin to access services from a victim advocate or through the helpline. There was no support system. They didn't have a place where they had a listening ear. They didn't have family or friends that believed them, or that supported them. And so you might be the first person that listens, that believes. And I think that's so important. And it's important for us to keep that in mind as we encounter male survivors on the helpline, is that we are opening a door of possibilities for them that they've never really experienced in their personal life or in their own community, in their own family or friends or place of worship, et cetera, in their workplace or their school, right? You are the first person that is listening. And that's such an important step that we want to honor. I'm sure all of you know that male victims are far less likely to report violence committed against them, right? And so that I think is a barrier for a lot of male survivors, that when they reach out through the helpline, they might not be ready to report or to follow through with any type of report on the perpetrator or the offender. And so while that is a process, right, for all victims and survivors, we have to, again, be really conscious that the society is sort of reaffirming those ideas that boys and men can't be victims. And so even, one of the things I would challenge you to do today is to look at your local municipal police department and pull up their crime victims report and just look at the gender breakdown of sexual violence. Like, how many female identified folks are reporting sexual violence? How many male identified folks have reported sexual violence in the last year? That data, that information should be available through your local police department. And so I encourage you just to take a look at that, because I think it will be really informative and help you understand that boys and men are reluctant to come forward and report that crime. And so, again, by reaching out to you through the helpline as a victim advocate and beginning to talk to them and offering the range of services that your center provides, you can really begin to help them think about, like, here are all the options that you have available before you, and that you are going to be accompanied, if that's a service that you provide, through this process, including reporting the abuse and holding the offender and perpetrators accountable. So I think that's really important for us to consider, that, again, when male identified folks are reaching out to you, you're opening up a world of possibilities for them, and your work is so critical and so important to the process of healing, of moving forward. And we also know that a lot of male survivors, when they do come forward, they might be coming forward much later in life. The offender, the perpetrator, might have passed away. The time that they could report and hold the offender or perpetrator accountable could have passed. And so I want us just to keep that in mind. But at whatever point they come to us, it is important, right? And that we're not going to, again, push any particular service or and we'll get into a little bit more of that as we move forward with this webinar. So, keeping all of that in mind, as we think about male survivors and the challenges that they experience and the things that they're coming to us with over the helpline, I want us to think about the helpline being an access point, right? Like I talked about, it is literally, you are opening the door of all the possibilities. And your role is so valuable and so important for the male survivor. And so think of yourself as an access point, an important point in that male survivor's life, in their journey of healing. One of the things that's really important, and one of the things that I struggled with very early on as a survivor of family violence myself, is the tremendous fear that I had, even though I was the only man that was working as a victim advocate in the shelter at the time here in Austin. When I first started victim advocacy, and was one of the few volunteers. Like, I had a tremendous amount of fear of other men, because the men in my life, the men in my community, were the offenders, were the perpetrators of that violence. The violence at home, the violence on the street, and the violence at school. And so I was very aware and I had to do my own work to not see all boys and men as potential perpetrators or offenders of domestic and sexual violence. And that was tremendously challenging. That was very challenging for me as a man and as a victim advocate to acknowledge that I carried that bias towards other boys and men, that were really rooted in fear. And so I had to do my own work to work through my feelings, my uneasiness with being able to respond to male survivors that were contacting us over the helpline, right? And not making assumptions and not assuming that they were an offender or a perpetrator contacting us and hanging up on them, or like I am guilty of all of those things as a young victim advocate. And it took time, and I worked with my mentors, the other victim advocates who had a lot more experience than I did before I started, and really working through those feelings and really getting past my uneasiness about boys and men who reached out to us over the helpline or who tried to access services as victims or survivors. And so I want to encourage you to just think about your feelings, your experiences with men that have reached out to you or to your agency over the helpline or in the community that have approached you, and what are the assumptions that you make immediately, and how difficult it is to put those aside and to really see the person and to really listen to them. And so I know it is challenging from personal experience, but I know it can be done because now I see boys and men as victims, that they can also be victims and survivors of sexual violence, that they also can be allies, because that's how I see myself, right? And that in itself was transformative when I began to change my ideas about the boys and men in my life and in my community, the boys and men who were accessing services. That was transformative, because at that point I knew that I was a model of what healing and what support could look like as a male identified person providing that support. And so I just want you to keep in mind that that in itself is very powerful, is how you receive, how you acknowledge, how you witness the stories that male survivors share with you over the helpline. So that requires for us to listen without judgment. And I know, again, this is the hard work of getting past our judgment and fully listening and fully embracing their reality, whatever that reality is. Again, all of us come from this place of wanting to begin by believing. And I know that to be true. And but when it comes to boys and men, because the majority of folks that we see and that we serve are predominantly female identified, our ideas about boys and men just don't match the experiences that we've had with girls and women that have come forward to our organizations for services. And so I just want you to just think about that, and what is listening without judgment look like, right? And sometimes that requires a tremendous amount of practice, and it's okay to make mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes as a victim advocate, and I want you to know that it is okay if you've made mistakes, and it's okay when you make mistakes. You will make mistakes with male survivors of sexual violence, and that's okay. But every mistake that we make on the helpline is a learning moment for us. And so that's why it's so critical to have supportive colleagues and partners, supervisors, volunteers that we can process these experiences with, and that we can work through these challenges that we're encountering ourselves, so that we don't become the barrier for that survivor who is reaching out through the helpline, especially boys and men. So all of that means that we meet male survivors where they're at in their healing journey. Like when they come to us, when they reach out to us over the helpline, they are at some point in their healing journey. Like we have to acknowledge that that step of picking up that phone and making that call is the most courageous act that they could do. Right? And they probably have picked up that phone, dialed the number, hung up. Like this is they have tried multiple times to make this phone call, but they either gave up or they didn't follow through with making that call. And when they finally do, your response will make a world of difference for how they move forward with, again, accessing services, not just on the helpline, but at your organization, and accessing the range of services off the helpline that you offer. So I want us just to reflect on that and to think about male survivors are going to come to us at different points in their lives. For most male survivors that we know, they are generally disclosing their abuse much later in life. And so you might get older male identified folks who are contacting you through the helpline, who have never disclosed their abuse. And they might be midlife, or they might be elders, or they might not have ever shared their stories with anyone else. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Oh, thank you, Nancy. So Nancy shared, Emiliano, that's right on listening without judgment implies understanding that we can only make our best judgment call based on the information we had. That also applies to our clients for sure. They can only use their best judgment based on where they're at along their human journey. I like that. Like you said, none of us want to become barriers to others. And if we do, by making mistakes, we can only hope to learn and never forget and move on. That applies to both clients and survivors. Absolutely. So there is an opportunity there for us to grow as victim advocates. And I'm still growing, even though I'm no longer at a rape crisis center. So as I work with victim advocates like yourself every day around the state of Texas, I learn from them because victim advocacy looks very different today than it looks 20 years ago. And so it's important that we are willing to learn from victim advocates that have a tremendous amount of experience in this area. And I encourage you to find mentors and to seek guidance from those who have more experience than you do, but also to remember that there's a lot of lessons that they can learn from you, right? In terms of your experience as a victim advocate. You might have had a little bit more experience in this area. So I encourage you to be a peer sort of trainer, mentor for your colleagues on the helpline, to share your experiences, to practice with them. All of those things are critical for enhancing our skills and this critical service that we provide. So thank you so much. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to think about is to use clear and consistent messages about victim survivor services. So as an organization, as a victim advocate, how do you articulate those services that you provide, and are they gender neutral, right? And that's so important, even within, if you or your organization use some sort of hotline manual, and that's a little old school. When I first started as a victim advocate, we had a paper hotline manual. And so there were literally scripts that we would use, especially with really difficult information or situations. But is there a clear, concise message about the services that you provide and that they are accessible to everyone? And that's what I mean by consistent messages about victim survivor services. What does that look like? What does that sound like? Especially if your organization still has women in it. And I respect that. I understand that it's definitely part of our history. But if your organization has that name, has the women in the title or girls in the title, or rape crisis center in the title, like really thinking about what message is going to resonate with boys and men that might be reaching out over the helpline, right? That they might not necessarily use that language. They might use the language of sexual abuse or sexual victimization. So really think about what does that language look like, and to develop that, right, over time, and to practice that, and to get feedback from clients that are accessing services. How does this message sound? Is it welcoming? Is it clear? Is it concise? Is it informative? And is it available, especially if you provide helpline services in other languages, right? Ensuring that it's culturally resonant and it's appropriately translated. So all of those things are really important to consider for sort of the development of ourselves as victim advocate, as well as the communicating the services that we provide. Like I said earlier, one of the things that we want to do and that we want to incorporate into our practice, and this requires a lot of practice, is marrying his language about his experiences of sexual violence. We know that sexual violence happens on a continuum. And so sexual violence doesn't always mean rape, always include penetration. We know as victim advocates that sexual violence occurs in different forms, whether it's sexual harassment that boys and men experience in the workplace or on the street or at school. We also know that it could be forms of molestation or touching or et cetera. I think we all understand that sexual violence occurs in different forms. So part of our job is to practice active listening, which I think all of us is an important skill that we learn as a victim advocate through our victim advocate training that IowaCASA provides, or even just through our practice alone, right? And I think it's important to find a partner, a colleague that you can practice active listening, that you can practice scenarios where you are, again, practicing this reflective language so to ensure that you are not using language that they're uncomfortable with. They might not see themselves as a victim of rape. Again, they might see themselves as a victim of abuse or a victim of sexual victimization, or a victim of sexual violence, right? So we also have to be aware of our language, and I'm very aware that when I talk about, especially in trainings with victim advocates and rape crisis centers, I use the terminology of sexual violence or sexual abuse, right? Because again, all of these are forms of and acts of violence, and these are all crimes. And so I think it's just important for us to be reflective and to take the time to practice this particular skill, especially with our family and friends. Are we practicing active listening in our own relationships, with our partners or with our children, or when we're on a date? Like, all of these things are things that we can practice, not just at our rape crisis center, but in our daily life, right? Communication is so critical. The act of listening, and actively listening, and really acknowledging what the other person is sharing, what the other person is saying, what the other person is feeling. And I think that's important for all of our relationships, not just our relationship to the victim or survivor that is contacting us over the helpline. Again, feel free to share any comments or questions in the chat box. I want to hear from y'all. So thank you so much for engaging with me. So if there's something that you hear me say that you like for me, you have a question about, please feel free to ask or comment. So this goes back to just asking male clients what you could do to expand access of the helpline. So as male survivors come come into your agency and they access the range of services that you provide, just ask them, do a focus group, conduct a survey, interview them one-on-one, you know, just to get a sense of what is working and what is not working, especially with the helpline. What was their experience was like, and encourage them to be honest and open. It might be helpful to do it as a confidential survey, so that survivors don't have to disclose the individual that they spoke to, or if they've had a negative experience, they might be reluctant to share that if the survey is not anonymous. So that's one way that you can acquire this information, is just listening, and without judgment, without being defensive, without asking for more details than they are willing to share. So this is an important practice for ourselves, right? Because we take, depending on your organization, for a lot of rape crisis centers, you'll be in a room with other helpline advocates. And so everyone is sort of listening into each other's call is intended to be support for the person that's receiving that call. And it's okay to ask your colleagues, what could I have done better? How could I have improved? Or this was difficult. I need help. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to know. It's okay not to have the answer. It's okay to tell the survivor, I don't know, but I'm going to find out for you. All of those things are really important, but most importantly, we want to hear from them, because we might assume that we're doing a great job. Like, there's no complaints. We're not receiving complaints. Nobody has complained to our bosses at the Rape Crisis Center, so I'm doing a great job. I assumed that of myself as a victim advocate, as a helpline advocate. And one of the things that we were just not asking the right questions. We were not being intentional about asking survivors about their experiences over the helpline. So this is only going to help us improve as victim advocates, both improve our skills as well as improve the training that we receive or the support that we need, just to be able to enhance the helpline services that we provide. Explore ways to offer crisis counseling with male survivors online or via text. Because of COVID, a lot of centers are moving towards these text options. So that might be out of your power, right? You might not have the power to make that decision at your agency, but maybe it's worth exploring, right? Is it cost effective? Is it a service that you can provide? A lot of male survivors are accessing text and helpline services online through various platforms. So there's amazing technology out there, whether it's through direct message on social media and being intentional about having somebody who can respond to those requests for information or assistance that survivors might have. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you have a really good day. So for folks that again are working on helplines, is this an organizational option? Is there a way for male survivors to contact you through social media or through email, or other forms of text messaging or direct messages to the organization? They may not be comfortable calling over the phone and speaking directly with somebody, but they might be more comfortable replying to an email or requesting information via text. So these are all things to consider. There are also questions of accessibility in terms of technology or people's ability to communicate, right? They may need interpretation. They may need some additional assistive services. So being able to provide helpline services through text and figuring out how we can make that available to individuals so that that service is more accessible to folks with different abilities. So that's primarily the reason why I want to mention it in today's webinar for us to consider. And if it's not in place, what do we need to ensure that we're providing accessible services to male individuals over the helpline. So I want to encourage you to consider that, to have conversations with your volunteers, with your coworkers, with your supervisors about this particular issue and how you can improve and make sure that your services are accessible to male survivors who need to be able to access services because of their abilities. So transitioning to think about what's in your resource toolbox, right? So I'm not fairly handy. So I want to acknowledge that. So this is a pretty cool looking toolbox. It's got a lot of really great tools in there. And I want you to just imagine and think about what's in your toolbox. Like, what is missing from your toolbox? How can you, what particular tools do you need to be the best helpline advocate that you can be? And that's what I want for you today. That's what I hope I'm getting, IowaCASA and myself are helping you get closer to that goal. And to me, I think that's requires ongoing work and a commitment to be here, right? You're attending today's webinar, and I think that's a significant step, because there are a lot of victim advocates for whatever reason aren't able to join us today and may need to access the recording because they're responding on the helpline, or they're doing victim advocacy work or other work at our agencies. But it's our willingness to put in the work, right? So when we have a tool, it's important for us to use it. So I just want to encourage you to think about your toolbox, and hopefully I can add some new tools to it. One of the things that I found really helpful, I mentioned earlier, for me as a young victim advocate, as someone who was new to victim advocacy and to helpline advocacy, is having resources that were available to me so that I could build my own understanding and my own professional development around this particular issue. There's so much information about male survivors of sexual violence that it's so important that we create and manage sort of a lending library of books, movies, etc., not just for male survivors, but for ourselves, right? So that we have the ability to learn and to familiarize ourselves with information, with resources that we might be referring to or providing over the helpline. That's why it's so important to create this sort of lending library. It could be a digital library that we create, or a particular resource that we're able to share by email or by text or through other forms with male survivors that might be reaching out over the helpline. And sometimes that's all male survivors are looking for is a resource, book, a film related to their experiences of sexual violence. It reaffirms to them that they're not alone, that there are other male survivors who have experienced what they have and who are doing the healing work. And so I definitely encourage you to look at what is available and to create your own lending library, even if it's a digital library of resources that you have access to and that your clients have access to. I love that. IowaCASA has digital resources that's shared through their listserv before, and includes organizations, articles, books, etc. And there is the link. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's such an important resource that you've developed. And I encourage you to review it and to create your own rape crisis under lending library of materials, right? Especially if that you can provide to all the helpline advocates, or even just ensure that those resources are available to everyone at your agency. Compile complete a resource audit, right? A resource audit is basically looking on an ongoing basis at the resources that you provide over the helpline. So if you have some sort of hotline or helpline resource guide, are those resources relevant? So when I provide a male survivor a particular resource, is it still available? Is it accessible for male survivors? Is it accessible to male identified folks? All of that's really important, is that we are able to identify and to look at all the services, the links, the resources, the phone numbers to make sure that they're working before we provide those. Because again, for male survivors that are accessing help over the helpline, if they run into, if you share a resource with them or you refer them to an agency and they're not able to access her, that's not you don't get to control what service another agency provides, but you can ensure that when that survivor reaches out to that agency, that they're going to be able to access the services that you have referred them to. So that's why a resource audit is so important, and that you conduct it as often as possible, because we know that organizations change, that phone numbers change, that website addresses change, that links no longer work to resources online. So we want to make sure that all of the resources that we provide over the helpline are still available. And so that requires some work. It requires for us to make phone calls to ensure that those links work, that information that you're referring that male survivor to is still available. I keep a pretty comprehensive resource around engaging boys and men. And I recently had to go through and just check all those links that I provided. And some of those organizations, some of those resources no longer exist or are available online. And so that's really important, because again, we don't want to create any additional barriers for male survivors that are trying to access information or services, especially outside of our center. Collect information, collect and confirm that you have the most up-to-date male survivor resource guide. So even create within your helpline advocacy guide or manual, create a section specifically for male survivors that have really unique and very specific resources for male survivors, including therapists that have external therapists outside of the Rape Crisis Center, private therapists or clinicians that have experience with working with and providing counseling and therapy to male survivors of sexual violence. Those are the kinds of resources that we want to make sure that we also are able to provide, because when male survivors may reach out to the helpline, they might have access to resources or insurance that might provide them with private care, private counseling, private support groups, that our services might not necessarily be necessary for them because they have access to resources. So you want to make sure that you're able to, again, refer them out and to partner with clinicians and other social service agencies, other institutions in the community, communities of faith that provide services to survivors, and add them to your resource guide. We are not while we would like to think that we are the go-to, the one-stop shop, we know that that's not always true. Our organizations cannot provide everything that our survivors come to us with or need. And so I want to encourage you to think about really beefing up your guide and ensuring that you have resources that are available outside of your Rape Crisis Center. And so create that male survivor resource guide. And I'd love to see them. So as you're developing them, I'd love to see them, and feel free to share them with me, and to share them with other rape crisis centers around the state of Iowa. That is so important as we're developing this content, as we're developing these resources, as we're developing curriculums for male survivors of sexual violence, et cetera, all of the things, all the services that we provide. It's important for us to think of ourselves as a model, and how do we share and collaborate with other rape crisis centers and other victim advocates that have experience, a little bit more experience than we do. Oh, thank you, Maddie. Yeah, so there's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any additional support or even encouragement. So I definitely think of myself as a cheerleader around this issue. So I encourage all of you just to think about what you can do. What is the thing that you can do today to enhance your own victim advocacy and your own work on the helpline? Share this resource, this guide via email, social media, or your website. So if you're creating something specifically, is it appropriate to share with your the male survivors that might be reaching out to you over the helpline, right? So maybe you create two. Maybe you create one that's specifically for helpline advocates, and then you create one that's specifically for male survivors in the community. And of course, you want to ensure that those are both accessible and available. You could have them available on your website so that individuals don't even have to contact the helpline to access that information or those resources. So one of the things that I did with my resource guide was I created a Google Doc, which allowed me to just share the link to that document and to update it or to add to it as I went on, because again, the information might change, the links might no longer work. So I'm able to update the Google Doc live, and it's a living, breathing document. So I would encourage you to consider creating and to using tools and technology that you have accessible to you to create accessible resources, again, for male survivors in your community, especially if you, again, serve culturally specific or communities that speak a different language other than English, right? So ensuring that information is translated and available to all male survivors and all communities that you serve. So I know here in Texas, and I'm sure as it is in Iowa, we serve a lot of very rural communities here in the state, people that may not have access to technology or just even internet access. So we want to ensure that those types of resources, those types of guides are available in paper, that we can either mail them or that they can pick up from our agency, or if we're doing community outreach, that we have available to folks as paper copies as well, whether that's brochures or resource guides, etc. You want to consider what's going to be most accessible for the boys and men in your community, right? And you might want to create a specific guide for boys or young men, and create a separate guide for adult men, because their needs, their experiences, their resources might be different. So while we haven't really talked much about boys and men, it's important to consider and to acknowledge that boys and men will contact you over the helpline. And then when they do, depending on what you are required by law in terms of reporting child abuse, then you as the helpline advocate are going to be responsible for reporting that disclosure of sexual abuse from a boy or a young man, depending on the age, the age of young people in Iowa, which honestly I don't know what that is, but I think it's important to just keep that in mind. What is our response to young people, to boys that might be contacting us over the helpline? It's not necessarily included in this webinar, but I want us just to take a moment to think about that. Are we prepared? Have we had that experience of responding to young people that have disclosed their experiences of sexual abuse or sexual violence with us? And what is our role and responsibility in reporting that abuse to law enforcement? So something to consider. And of course, IowaCASA is a tremendous resource and can support you in that area as well. So that's specific to your organizational policies as well as the laws in Iowa. So all things to consider as we move forward. Provide ongoing training opportunities on male survivors for local doctors, social worker, therapists, etc. So one of the things that I know, again, you might not be in a position to do, but can you begin to engage in conversations within your agency, within your colleagues that don't respond to the helpline, that don't answer helpline calls? Can we begin to explore those other resources, those other individuals in the community that are going to encounter male survivors of sexual violence? And can we ensure that they are prepared to respond so that they themselves don't become barriers to access information or resources? Because I might disclose my experiences of abuse with a trusted doctor, a trusted counselor, a social worker, a therapist, etc. And so we want to make sure that those individuals see the Rape Crisis Center as the primary resource for survivors of sexual violence, especially for boys and men who experience sexual violence, right? Like, we want them to see us as the primary source for support for boys and men who experience sexual violence, right? So that requires for us to be in the community, to talk to our allies, to partner with them, to communicate with them. And again, it could just be a phone call. It could be just an email to confirm that they provide services, or would they like additional information or additional training or additional support around this particular issue. It might not be in the menu of things that we reach out to individuals about in the community, but beyond just asking for folks for financial support or donations, we really want to see them as allies, because we know that they're going to encounter boys and men who experience sexual violence as well. And so we want to make sure that they are prepared to support those boys and men that come forward to them. Any questions or comments about that? Just some things for us to consider, again, for folks who, for just conversations for us to have at our organizations or with our coworkers or even our supervisors. All right. So we are now at this point where I want to share some resources with you. And it's so funny because at this point, I don't usually have this kind of time to be able to talk about the resources in a lot of detail. But I want to familiarize yourself with some of these really great resources that are available to you as a helpline advocate. I think it's important, again, that as we are developing our own capacity around this issue, because what we sometimes only have control over is ourselves. Like, we may not be able to control the training or the information that we provide, but we definitely can improve and enhance the way that we provide victim advocacy over the helpline. So here's some resources that I want to share with you. These are specifically for you. The first one is this magazine from the Washington State Sexual Assault Coalition. And so it's called Connections. They wrote a really great publication on male survivors of sexual violence. It's a tremendous resource. So it's available as a digital download, as a PDF document. And so just Google it, Connections, male survivors of sexual violence, and boom, you're going to have access to it. It's a tremendous publication. And just review it, share it. It's what's wonderful as a PDF form. It's easily downloaded, printed, and shared. And I want to encourage you to do that with your colleagues that aren't in today's webinar. And so you'll find additional resources for victim advocates in this publication, but it's tremendous. There's nothing else like it that our sister coalitions have created. And so I highly recommend this publication. I think it will provide you with some additional guidance as you continue to provide helpline advocacy. This is a phenomenal documentary. If you haven't seen it, it's called Boys and Men Healing. There's a digital copy available that you can review. There's also a DVD if you're old school like me. I love DVDs. I love CDs. So you can actually purchase a DVD of this film. It's a really powerful documentary. I don't know if anyone in the audience has seen it, but Boys and Men Healing, I highly recommend that all of you watch it. And you add it to your lending library for male survivors of sexual violence. The stories of these male survivors are just amazing. So powerful. Like if you thought Kevin's story was powerful, the diverse experiences of male survivors in this film and in terms of their identity, their experiences of sexual violence are so just so powerful and so important for us to hear. And so I encourage you to access it if you're able to, or to even purchase a copy of it for your Rape Crisis Center. This is another documentary called The Voiceless. It's a number of vignettes from male survivors of sexual violence. And this one is unique because the individuals are a little bit younger than the Boys and Men Healing. Those tend to be older men. The Voiceless tends to include male survivors, a little bit young, college-age men. So there's a lot of really, there's a little bit more diversity in The Voiceless than you'll see in Boys and Men Healing. The Voiceless is only available as a digital copy, so you can also download it. It's a really powerful documentary that was directed by a survivor, a woman who is a survivor herself, and has her own story, and really felt like was encountering a lot as she told her story, just like some of you who identify as survivors and have shared your story. One of the things that you experience is people coming forward and sharing their own stories of sexual violence with you. And so she experienced a lot of boys and men coming forward and sharing their own experiences of sexual violence and sexual abuse. And so she invited some of those male identified folks to share their stories in this documentary called The Voiceless. So I highly encourage you to watch it. Unfortunately, both of these films are not available on Netflix yet, but they're both worth watching, and again, adding to your library for victim advocates as well as for male survivors in your community. This is Voicemail. This is a national magazine. It's a quarterly men's magazine, and it's for everyone. It's not just for men, but for anyone who is interested in learning more about masculinities and really thinking about how do we engage men and male identified folks who are around both the prevention and the victimization of domestic and sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. And so this is a really important publication that has been around since the late 70s. And most folks have never read it. It's available as a digital magazine as well. So you can go to voicemail.org and you can actually request paper copies of this magazine. So they actually print this magazine. And so you could get a bulk subscription for your Rape Crisis Center. So here in Texas, we provide copies of this magazine to our Rape Crisis Centers so that they can use it as a resource to share with the boys and men that they might be encountering, whether it's over the helpline or in the community. It's just an additional resource that Rape Crisis Centers can provide, or that you can have in your waiting rooms as male survivors begin to access your services. So those are all things to consider, right? What are the kinds of materials, the kinds of resources, the kinds of posters or materials that are on the wall in your office as male survivors transition from the helpline into accessing other services at your Rape Crisis Center. So just one thing to consider and to add to your library, Voicemail magazine. So it includes a number of articles related to masculinities, and it's included some articles specifically written by and for male survivors of sexual violence. So check it out. Highly recommend. Of course, an important resource, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the No More campaign. They've created some specific messaging, digital posters and paper posters. I don't know if the paper posters are available still, but there's some PSAs and some digital posters that are specific to male survivors of sexual violence like this one. So no more that doesn't happen to guys, right? So you'll see some celebrities, primarily from SVU, are part of this campaign. And it's a campaign, again, of No More in partnership with 1 in 6 and the Joyful Heart Foundation. And it's just an additional resource if you are looking, again, to promote your helpline services and you're looking for messaging to reach the male survivors in your community so that they know too that your services are available to them. So as an organization, as you're doing outreach, as you're encouraging male survivors to come forward and access the helpline, There are a lot of wonderful messaging, and this campaign is just a great tool to add, again, to your toolbox. One Blue String is a national campaign. It's another campaign. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the statistic 1 in 6. 1 in 6 boys and men experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And so 1 in 6 created this campaign where you add one blue string to your guitar as a way to raise awareness about the experiences of boys and men who in sexual violence. And so they have a whole series of, like, if there's a musician in your life, if you're trying to do outreach with people who are musicians, bands in your community, especially bands that are made of primarily boys or men, it's just a wonderful way to, again, to raise awareness and to do outreach around the issue of male survivors of sexual violence. So definitely check out One Blue String, and if you're a musician, add that string to your guitar. This is the Resources on the Go podcast. Is from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. It's a phenomenal new resource, and all of us, I am a podcast junkie. I listen to all kinds of podcasts, and one of the podcasts that I recently subscribed was to this one. I recently recorded, and they've been recently offering a series every Wednesday on male survivors of sexual violence. And it's a phenomenal series. If you haven't heard any of them, they're tremendous. And they're available through any of the podcast platforms that you listen to. I encourage you to subscribe and to tune into and share the podcast series on male survivors of sexual violence. The reason I share it with you is because I recorded four podcasts, so they should be coming out later this year, 2 of them in English and 2 of them in Spanish, specifically about the needs and experiences of male survivors, outreach with male survivors, helpline, some additional information in Spanish about providing services over the helpline. So if you are a Spanish-speaking advocate, a Latino advocate who is working with male survivors, I encourage you hopefully to tune into those, and to download those podcasts and to share them with your other bilingual or Latino advocates in Iowa. So I'm very excited about that. But the series that's available, right, the podcasts that are part of the series, highly recommend. The most current one is about serving male survivors who are incarcerated or who are detained. So it's just really important information to consider, especially if you're working or receiving calls from individuals over the helpline who are incarcerated or who are in detention or who are in jail, prison, etc. So it's just some things to consider as you work with male survivors of sexual violence. But there's all these wonderful resources that are available to you right now that I encourage you to take advantage of. And then finally, the Good Men Project is a blog platform specifically for male-identified folks, and women, of course, write blogs around masculinity issues. But this is the audience for this blog is male-identified folks, and they've written a number of pieces, and you'll find a number of pieces from me specifically about male survivors of sexual violence and sexual abuse. So I encourage you to just go to the Good Men Project, just do a search about sexual violence or sexual abuse, and you'll see a series of blog posts, blog articles that, again, you can add to your resource library that you can share with survivors that might be reaching out over the helpline. But more importantly, so that you continue to learn and to understand the different experiences of male survivors around the country. And so all of these are resources for you to enhance your abilities as a helpline advocate, and just to ensure that you are doing the best job that you can. And I appreciate all of you and all the work that you do every day on the front line. So some additional resources specifically for male survivors, as well as for you. So if you are looking for additional professional development in a particular area, these resources are for you, but they're also available to male survivors. Just Detention International is an important resource for for folks who are working with individuals who are incarcerated or who are detained. So Just Detention International does a lot of training, it provides a lot of training, a lot of information, a lot of technical assistance to individuals and organizations that are working with survivors who are in detention or who are in prison, in jail, juvenile detention, etc. So Just Detention is just a great resource. I definitely encourage you to take advantage and to share this resource with male survivors that are incarcerated themselves. So Just Detention provides a lot of support and a lot of services to individual male survivors who are incarcerated. Of course, I mentioned no more earlier. Check out their website, see all of the resources and information that they provide. They're primarily a campaign and they don't provide any real direct services. So that's what's unique about No More, but it's an important campaign because again, they have included messaging and specifically targeting male survivors of sexual violence. So there might be some really great resources that you can share as you're doing, as you're talking to folks who just want to help. Because one of the things that I didn't acknowledge, but I will acknowledge right now before, is that it's not just the male survivors who are calling the helpline. It's family members and friends, it's classmates, it's coworkers that might be contacting the helpline to get support for the male survivor in their life, or who may need support themselves, right? So it's important, again, that we think critically, not just about the male survivor, but about the people, the loved ones in their life that might be accessing our services and accessing our support. The male survivor may not be ready, but the family member, the friend, the loved one, the coworker, classmate, etc., might be ready. They might need support. And again, as a helpline advocate, you have an opportunity to provide them with information and support that they need to best support the male survivor in their life. Because we know that trauma affects all of us and affects us as well. And so that's why at the beginning, I talked about taking care of yourself, right? Doing some self-care as a helpline advocate, because the stories that we hear, we're listening every day, sometimes 8 hours a day or longer. We're listening to people's trauma. And so if one thing I can leave with you today is how important and valuable and how much you should take care of yourself. I honestly will not go back to victim advocacy. So that's why I really admire all of you for the work that you are doing. I am burnt out. And one of the lessons that I didn't learn was the skills, just how to take care of myself, how to ask for help, how to access self-care, as well as counseling, right? Because the impact of the stories that we hear from survivors, especially on the helpline, can be so difficult to hear. So I encourage you to take care of yourself in whatever way is best for you. So of course, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center is just a hub of all kinds of really wonderful resources for you and for rape crisis centers and for sexual assault coalitions around sexual violence. And they have really developed and compiled a lot of great resources and a lot of research around male survivors of sexual violence. So I encourage you to check out the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. If you've never visited their site before, it's tremendous. They also provide all of the additional resources around Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. So there's just a tremendous amount of information and resource. It can be a little overwhelming, but if you specifically search for male survivors of sexual violence, you'll get all of the information, the resource, the curriculum, the books, all the materials that they have available in their hub online. So definitely check that out. VAWA.net is a similar hub. If you're not familiar with VAWA.net, definitely encourage you to check it out and to explore their site. Again, very similar to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, where there's resources for you. Now, these are not resources specifically for male survivors of sexual violence. These, again, are really focused and intended to support you in the work that you do with male survivors of sexual violence. If you're not familiar, I would encourage you to check out SNAP. It specifically works with survivors who have experienced some form of abuse from faith leaders. Specifically, SNAP was formed primarily by survivors of priest abuse within the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's a international organization that organizes male survivors that include male survivors of sexual abuse from the clergy. And so it's a great resource. They have support groups, and they also give male survivors who have experienced clergy abuse, empower them to share their story and to actively get involved in terms of holding individuals who have abused, faith leaders who have abused boys in the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a tremendous organization. Again, if you encounter any male survivor who experienced sexual abuse at the hands of a priest or a clergy person, this is a great resource for them. So there's a lot of SNAP chapters around the country. And so we definitely check out their website and see if there's a SNAP chapter in your community or in the state of Iowa. It's a really important resource, and it can be very healing and very transformative for survivors of abuse in the church. And then Forge, our friends at Forge, who are doing tremendous work around trans and gender nonconforming folks who experience sexual violence. So Forge is a wonderful organization. I imagine some of you have received training in technical assistance from Forge at the Iowa Coalition. If you're not familiar with Forge, I encourage you to follow them across your social media platforms, access their training and their technical assistance. Specifically, if you encounter any trans men, gender nonconforming individuals who experience sexual violence. So Forge is a great resource in terms of developing our own capacity. And one of the things that we had explored earlier was just acknowledging our biases and acknowledging our deficits in terms of the survivors that we don't understand. And we may not understand the experiences of trans men and trans boys who experience sexual violence. And so Forge provides a tremendous amount of training and information regarding the experiences and how we can best support transgender individuals who experience sexual violence. And so I highly recommend checking out Forge and accessing all of their information and resources at no cost to you and to your center. And so definitely check out Forge. So all of these are really great resources. I hope you're making note and you will reach out to them today. Yes, thank you. Yeah, any questions or comments that you have, feel free to share them in the chat. So these are resources specifically for male survivors. So as you're encountering male survivors over the helpline, there are 3 primary services, national services for male survivor. They all provide very different services, and some are specific to certain types of experiences of sexual violence. So malesurvivor.org is the first one. It's probably the oldest organization that provides general service for any male survivor of sexual violence. So any experience of sexual violence at any point in their life, they provide a lot of really great information for friends, family members, coworkers, classmates, etc. They have a lot of really great information, not just for the survivor, but their loved ones. And so malesurvivor.org is a great resource. They provide some training as well. So definitely follow them across social media platforms. They share a lot of really wonderful information, a lot of healing information specifically for male survivors. And so definitely check out their website, explore the work that they do. 1 in 6 is a national organization that provides services to childhood sexual abuse survivors. So any man who's experienced some form of childhood sexual abuse at any, who might be coming forward and disclosing their story, they provide all kinds of information and resources for clinicians, for victim advocates, for family members, friends, loved ones of anyone who's experienced childhood sexual abuse. So that's primarily, it's easy for us to remember because it's 1 in 6. So 1in6.org, definitely check them out and all the resources and information that they provide. In addition, they have a 24-hour hotline that helpline that they provide over their website. And so they're able to provide text, chat, helpline information for survivors that are on their website. So that's a really important resource. It's really unique. In addition, they've been offering therapeutic support groups for male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. That's really unique and is accessible online. And so if you have a client or someone that you encounter that's looking for a support group, but it's not a service that you may offer, you can definitely refer them to 1 in 6, and they can access a support group, therapeutic support group with a therapist online. So it's a really wonderful and great resources, especially if it's not something that your center is able to provide at this time. And then finally, Men Healing. Men Healing primarily provides what's called weekends of recovery. Just for the sake of transparency, I just recently joined the board of directors for Men Healing, and they provide just wonderful support to all male survivors of sexual violence. And so they primarily do that work through weekends of recovery, where male survivors come together and have access to therapists and other male survivors and do healing work. It's really transformative, and that is usually one of the first or steps later on for male survivors when they're finally ready to disclose their experiences of sexual violence or sexual abuse with other survivors in a therapeutic, safe setting. So they're offering those virtually right now, those weekends of recovery. They have a tremendous team of clinicians, of therapists that work and that have wonderful experience, really strong experience and a background with working with male survivors of sexual violence and sexual abuse. So definitely check out Men Healing. Follow all these organizations online yourself. Familiarize yourself with what they provide. So again, as you're referring male survivors on the helpline, you're providing the most appropriate referral. And there might be information that specifically you can share on these websites or even social media that might be helpful to an individual that you're speaking to over the helpline. All right, so let's wrap this thing up. So one of the things that I want you to think about is, what are your next steps? As I talked about earlier, I want you to think about that one simple thing, that small thing that you can do today at the end of today's webinar. Is there a conversation that you can have with your colleagues? Is there a conversation that you can have with the boys and men in your life? Is there a conversation that you can have with the male survivors in your life that you know and that you love and that you live with, or that you worship with, or that you work with, etc.? Right? Is there something that you can provide to them? Just have the conversation. Share Kevin's story on your own personal social media. But more importantly, I want you to reflect, and I want you to write this down on a Post-it and post it in your office, so you can remind yourself every day, these are the steps that I'm going to take to enhance your helpline services, right? So as a helpline advocate, what am I going to do today to ensure that these services are accessible and available to male survivors of sexual violence? That one thing that you can do. I just want you to keep that in mind and remind yourself every day of that thing that you're committed to doing. That's the most important step, is just being here in today's webinar or watching this recording, but also just committing to taking these small actions, these small steps to improving helpline services for male survivors of sexual violence. So this is what I call a closing statement. And so you are welcome to share this in the chat room. I want you to pick one sentence. One of these sentences, I want you to fill in the blank. And feel free to share it in the chat room as just a way to close this time together. And I just want to give you an opportunity to share that, and we'll open it up for questions as well, if folks have any. And it's also a good time for me to drink some water. So I see that there are 29 of us in here, and you can just keep it to yourself, or you can share it in the chat room. Daisy said she appreciated the resources. Thank you, Daisy. Anybody else? Jocelyn, are there any questions or comments that, oh, I appreciated the entire webinar. Thank you, Annie. Any questions or comments? I appreciated more interest around the topic. Smiley face emoji. Thank you, Jake. I appreciated the time to share, to learn about how to better understand our clients and serve the community the best of our abilities. Thank you, Jasmine. Hannah, I figured out I don't have to recreate the wheel. Lots of great resources out there that I can bring into our program. Absolutely. Jasmine, thank you so much for the Spanish speaking resources. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you all so much for attending today's webinar and for the work that you do. And for those who are watching this recording, I wish you luck. And if there are any questions or comments, I'm available, or you can also feel free to call or email me afterwards, or just reach out to me on social media as well. I'm available on all the platforms, so I encourage you to follow me, especially if you're interested specifically in this issue of male survivors. You'll find a lot of that information related to engaging men around sexual violence prevention, male survivors of sexual violence on my Twitter. And you can find me on Twitter, and I hope you follow me there. Thank you, Mary.
And thank you so much, Emiliano. This is Maddie. We so appreciate all the information and resources. I just want to point everyone to the chat box, the evaluation link, and I will put it in here again, is right in there. Filling out the evaluation takes about 3 minutes, give or take. It really helps us to be able to give you all the best possible training and resources. And then also so this was a 2-hour continued education hours credit. So you'll be receiving certificates for that here from Kelsey, who is our technology and training specialist, probably within the next 1 to 2 weeks, give or take. Jocelyn, is that correct? But being able to fill out the evaluation definitely helps us out. And then Jake, to your question, is there a list of male advocates in this line of work? Yeah, Jocelyn just answered. So we don't currently have a list, but so I've been talking with someone at the Resource Sharing Project, Norio Amezu Hall, who is a great resource and part of our team here at IowaCASA. And he and I have been talking about, similar to what Emiliano does in Texas. They have a Texas Speak group where there are men who work with male advocates or male identified individuals doing this work, just basically finding support around this issue. So we're definitely, I know Jocelyn took down your information. We can definitely stay in touch with you about developments as far as that. And Emiliano may also have some additional resources he can recommend. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if Maddie is participating as much as he can in the Texas Men Speak. It's a monthly virtual gathering for male identified individuals who are victim advocates, who are prevention educators, who are working with boys and men outside of rape crisis centers. So it's just a monthly gathering where we explore issues related to masculinities and sexual violence, whether it's victim advocacy or prevention. And everyone is welcome to join, especially if you're trying to organize something similar in your own state. And so I definitely would extend an invitation to any male identified folks in Iowa that are interested in organizing something similar. And if I can be of any support in terms of creating a similar group, I am happy to help do that. So I also just wanted to acknowledge and to thank our interpreters and our captioner for the work that they did during today's webinar. So I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for the services that you provide to folks on this webinar. So thank you for that work.
Thank you, Emiliano. This is Maddie. So yeah, without further ado, again, I'm just going to plug it in here one more time. Please feel free to take the evaluation. We'll also be sending out the link with your certificates for that as well. We appreciate as many of you as possible filling that out. If you have any other questions, Emiliano, I don't know if you want to post your email one last time in the chat box. Feel free to reach out to us, reach out to Emiliano. And with that, I think that this concludes today's webinar. And thank you all so much for joining us and participating. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Please take care. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.